Some black science fiction and fantasy fans wonder why there were no superheroes during the golden age of comic books from the 1930s to the 1950s. And the answer to that is very simple. There were no black publishers during the golden age of comic books from the 1930s to the 1950s. While there were black newspaper publishers out there, there were no magazine publishers. And magazines are how comic books were published and sold. The history of the comic book starts with Pulp Fiction. And Pulp Fiction were stories that featured the adventures of incredible type heroes having fantastic adventures. And these type of adventures were usually done like in a book format. So most people for 10 cents usually got two action-packed adventures in one volume in a Pulp Fiction magazine. And that's how the superhero got its roots. The roots of primarily for superheroes come from two characters, Doc Savage and the Shadow, who were published by the Street and Smith publishers. And these publishers pretty much laid out the foundation for everything regarding the superhero paradigm. Everything that we know for superheroes started out with Doc Savage and the Shadow. Doc Savage was the original Superman. His first name was Clark. He had a fortress of solitude way out in the Arctic, and he had the utility belt, the weapons, the whole 9 yards. And same thing with the Shadow, with the mind clouding and the dark and mysterious stuff. They laid the foundation for everything, and that's what the roots of it were regarding superheroes. And when comic books came along a couple of years later with Superman and Batman, again, the publishers were pretty much, they were white owned, and they were only out to make adventures that featured characters that reflected the views of the publishers and characters that the publishers could relate to. And that's why we didn't see, any Negro superheroes at the time. A lot of people wondered, why that was the case, but that was, how it was. This is why back then we saw, the only black people we saw really were coon characters like your whitewashed and your slow mo Jones, and that's that's how people depicted black people back then. I've been reading about Pulp Fiction for about a couple of years now. When I was doing research for the ISIS series, I learned a little bit more about Pulp Fiction because I started reading about the character of Doc Savage. It kind of interested me, and that made me, delve a little deeper into the history of Pulp Fiction, the history of publishing, and the history of comic books. And then I looked at it, and I said to myself, there's something very interesting here. I don't see any black characters. I don't see any black stories being told in this genre. I don't see any type of black characters from the 1930s to the 1950s. And when I did further research into it, I found out there were no black publishers of magazines. And back then, everything was segregated. So the only publishers, white publishers published was characters that were white. And black publishers usually published characters that were black. And because there were no black magazine publishers from the 1930s to about 1945, when John H. Johnson established the Johnson Publications and started publishing things like Ebony, Jet, Tan, I think, and Hue, there were no magazines featuring African Americans in the genre. And that's why we didn't see black superheroes in the Golden Age. And it really is a shame because we didn't really see black superheroes until the 1960s with the first appearance of the Black Panther and then the Falcon after that. And seeing what happened, with Pulp Fiction was one of the things that, inspired me to write a new story I did called ISIS Imitation of Life. And I thought about, the Pulp Fiction period of the Golden Age. And I said to myself, I really wanted to tell a story of what happened to a heroic character or a fantasy character during this time and the things that they had to deal with during this Golden Age period. Because this is a period that nobody has ever really told a story about. Yes, I've heard about, the whole truth thing with the Black Captain America, but that really I feel really skimmed the surface of what regards to black people and the black experience. I feel it didn't really tell a strong enough story. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do the ISIS imitation of life story. Because I wanted to talk about, what heroes had to deal with, a black hero would have to deal with in the golden age. Things like like racism, Jim Crow, the specter of communism that hovered over America during the 30s, because communism was a big thing in the black community and it was a big specter over the black community. And I wanted to talk about, black culture like black sororities, black colleges, because these were major institutions at the time in the African American community. I also, deal with the image of African Americans during this time period, the minstrel images, the racial images, and how people dealt with that. And these were all subjects that I explored in the Imitation of Life story, because I really wanted to, take a hard look at life for black people during the 1930s and what a super character would have to do, in order to fight the good fight during this, very tense and hard time period. Because people think that, oh, there were just racists in the South. No, there was discrimination for black people in the North. Even though it was free, they were limited to certain jobs and doing and living a lower class lifestyle. And I wanted to explore, all of these subjects, in depth. This is something that I did not see being explored, regarding the African American experience. And I wanted to dig deep into this subject matter. And I spent over a year and a half just doing research on the golden age of pulp fiction, black culture, black history, to write this fantasy story. And I really wanted to give people, an educational experience in addition to the fantasy, about black culture and black history. And, in addition to a fantastic superhero adventure. Um, and I learned a lot, over the time doing the research for this. And that's one of the things that I did learn again was that there were no black publishers, sadly, from the 1930s to about 1945, and we lost, 15 years of great stories. I mean, I imagine what it could have been if we had a black publisher publishing pulp fiction. That could have really inspired and helped black people, start to imagine themselves in different roles and see themselves, in a fantastic way. They could have really, been inspired by that. But we didn't have, black publishers back then. We had black newspaper publishers, but they were reporting what was going on, with all the lynchings and all the horrific violence that was going on down south. And they also reported, good things, like things went on in the Harlem Renaissance. But we really missed out by not having any magazine publishers to tell, our stories and our experiences out there. There were no magazines, from 1933 or so, when I think the first Shadow and Doc Savage came out, and to about 1945 when Ebony was published. Um, and that was a sad thing to see that we didn't have that. And then when we had comic book characters in the Golden Age, sadly, they were coons like your Whitewash, who was a member of the Young Allies, and your Slow Mo Jones, who was the Wizard's sidekick. And if you look at the comic panels with those two characters, you will see, sadly, what some white people thought of black people. You didn't get to see who we really were. And I really wanted to show with this ISIS imitation of life story what black people really were like during that golden age, of heroes, and what they had to deal with during that golden age, um, of heroes, and that pulp style story. And I want to tell a pulp style story, from that type of experience, from the black experience. I want to talk about our culture, talk about what was a hero to us and what type of hero we needed, because our type of, while white people were having fantastic adventures, we were dealing with things like your Jim Crow, your racism, your discrimination, and some of us were trying to lay the foundation, for the civil rights movement that came about, 30 years later. And those are things that I wanted to that I wrote about in the story. But I liked learning about Pulp Fiction, and I wanted people to learn about more about the history of it, and why we didn't have any black characters back then. I believe if we had black characters then, it would have a major impact on the African American experience and the African American imagination. I mean, around 1945, that was also when we saw the first black comic artist. That was Matt Baker, who worked for a major comic book company. He was the first black comic artist to work for a major publisher. He used to draw Phantom Lady for Fox Features Publishing, Fox Publishing. But we don't. A lot of people don't know that there were people like that out. They don't know about Matt Baker. They don't know about Pulp Fiction. I wanted to teach a little bit more about it and share what I learned, because Pulp Fiction was a major influence on my writing, and comic books were a major influence on my writing. Um, Books like the ISIS series, these books were inspired by comic books and Pulp Fiction, and I also pay homage to Pulp Fiction with the story Isis All About the Goddess. This is a story that I made to pay a homage to it, and the cover pays homage to it because this is the way a lot of pulp novels from the 50s used to look. They used to look like this, so I wanted to pay homage to it. Um, and with Pulp Fiction, I find that in the modern age there are a lot of talented people, who can produce the type of black pulp fiction that people are used to. I have a friend, Mike Williams. He produces a great strip called Deke Sledge about a private investigator who goes out and solves crimes. And in this strip, it's just like a pulp fiction type story. It's very gritty, very very gritty, very dark, and very action packed. And this is a great strip. It features a black private investigator, and I'm gonna leave a link to it in the description box. And I think you'll really enjoy it. Um, and when I will always go out, I go out and look for unique things like black pulp fiction, black science fiction, black fantasy, and I try to share it with people. And the reason why I want to make this video is because I want people to understand how important this genre really is. Because with fantasy and science fiction and pulp fiction, this is where kids this is where kids learn how to read. This is where kids learn how to imagine. This is where kids see themselves in a different light, and they get ideas for their future. I mean, a lot of ideas came from Pulp Fiction. Things like Doc Savage, he came up with concepts like television and all sorts of inventions before they became invented. And I think somebody had to have read things like your Pulp Fiction or watched your Star Trek in order to get the ideas for these inventions that we use every day and take for granted. And when we have black writers producing this type of material for black people, I believe those people are going to learn and see themselves differently, imagine themselves differently, and even get inspirations to create things that we use and apply in our own personal lives. Isis Imitation of Life is a book I have planned to release in 2016. It's going to be part of a Kickstarter that I'm planning for the SJS Direct imprint. And I really need to raise funds to pay for the cover for Isis Imitation of Life. So I'm going to launch a Kickstarter in January, and I need everybody's support to help pay for this Kickstarter so that I can put, professional cover like the one I put for Isis Wrath of the Cyber Goddess and Isis Night of the Vampires on Isis Imitation of Life. And I really want to put that professional cover on there because I really need to get that positive first impression on people, because this is a story that I believe is very important. Black people need to really see what happened during the Golden Age. Just because white publishers didn't tell the story of black heroes during the Golden Age doesn't mean that these heroes did not exist and that they did not have stories to tell. And I really want to get this book out here because I believe it's a very important book, and it will really educate people about what went on during the tense period of the 1930s, and really get them to understand, what black fantasy characters or black heroes had to deal with, in contrast to the fantastic adventures that many of your white characters had. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.